It is a pleasure to introduce you to Hoda's Career Info. My name is Hoda Kilani, career and academic coach at Right Career Fit. Coaching is all about storytelling, helping you to envision and tell your story your way. I put the series together to share stories of inspiring career people from across the globe. I hope their stories motivate you to envision your career story, discover your road to success, or recast your career path. More importantly, I hope that you love these career stories as much as I do. Our guest today is Jeff Griffiths.
The whole notion of developing people, of growing people, is the cornerstone of any successful business. If you've convinced yourself that your skill set isn't fixed and that you can grow and learn and that that's a continuous process, that that encourages you to keep going. Try things, experiment with things, learn things. Don't be afraid of having the wrong answer. The reality is, in the real world, there aren't all that many mistakes that you can't recover from.
Thank you for joining Hoda's Career Info, your career program where guests from across the globe share career tips and personal stories to help you successfully navigate your career. Watch, listen, and learn. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and follow me on social media for more career info. More importantly, make sure you have that very important career conversation with a career professional. Our guest today, Jeff Griffiths, is the director of the Skills Innovation and Productivity Center at the Canada West Foundation, a public policy think tank based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where he leads a team focused on pragmatic public policy to enhance the human capital and, by extension, the economic prosperity of Canada's western provinces. Jeff is also a principal at Workforce Strategies International, focused on competency-based workforce and organizational development consulting for small to medium-sized businesses in the construction, manufacturing, and natural resources sectors. Jeff speaks and writes extensively on competency-based approaches to selection, onboarding, training, and certification and credentialing. This passion developed during his first career as an officer in the Canadian military. Jeff Griffiths joins me today to talk about the amazing work he has accomplished and continues to accomplish, and to tell us all about his newly launched website, jeffgriffiths.ca. Welcome, Jeff Griffiths, to Hoda's Career Info. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks.
The first question for you, Jeff, is what's the term that best describes the work that you do today? And how would you define it from your perspective? So not from the perspective of Google search or dictionary.
Well, I've described myself as a competency geek, you won't find that on Google. So my work professionally for the last 25 years or more has been really focused on competency-based approaches to success. So at the micro level, with individual companies, I have a company called Workforce Strategies International, myself and a couple of partners. We work with small and medium-sized businesses in manufacturing, construction, and the natural resources sectors. And what we're trying to do is to help them identify what the competencies are that they need, what people actually need to be able to do, what doing it right looks like, and then help them use competencies of the people they have, grow the competencies of the people they have to better execute on their strategies. And if we go through that process and they have gaps, well, then figure out how we're going to fill them. So it's the usual what you call a make or buy decision, right? So we're going to grow skills, acquire skills from outside, or even outsource things that are not really core to your business, and helping companies do a better job of that. And to do that as obviously as rapidly and as cost effectively as possible. So that's on the micro side. The macro side of what I do, I'm also, since the spring, I've been the Director of Skills Innovation and Productivity at the Canada West Foundation, so policy think tank based here in Calgary. And so I work with a team there, and we're looking at the macro side of human capital policy and how it impacts business success and prosperity across Western Canada, so from BC to the Ontario border. And by extension, I mean, we believe that if it's good for the West, it's probably good for the rest of the country too. So those kinds of policy alternatives that we're coming up with, we hope are good for Canada as a whole and our competitiveness internationally. So that's kind of what I do. It's what I've been doing since my first career, which was in the military, and I'm still doing it now and expect to be doing it for a while yet.
I loved your term. That's very nicely put and it's unique. So you mentioned you're in the military, and can you please share with the audience your story and embed with it perhaps a message you learned through living your story?
My first career was in the Canadian military. I was an officer in the Air Force, mostly in air defense roles. So I was in the fighter world, but I wasn't flying a fighter. I was on the radar side. And one of the things that I think was clear and became clear through my career, but was right from the beginning, is that in the military, competency is really all that matters. What you can do matters a whole lot more than anything else, and particularly in the Canadian military, because we're very small and we don't have the luxury of a lot of specialization. So when I became, I was a deputy commander of a tactical radar squadron for about a few years back in the 1990s. And it became really clear to me in operations that the competency of the individual was what mattered. I didn't care who you were. I don't care where you learned it. I don't care what your cap badge said you were supposed to be able to do. If you knew how to do it, if you could do it, and we were embracing this notion of whole person competency. Everything you've ever done, everything you've ever experienced is part of the competencies that you can bring to the job. And it's important to take advantage of it if you can as a business. So we took that originally at 12 Radar because we had very few people. And so we were looking at competency and cross-training people and using all of the skills that people had, mostly because we needed to. I mean, originally out of necessity. Eventually, it became something we did on purpose because we realized how effective it was. Because at that squadron, we were able, with less than 20 people, to do work that other units within NATO were taking 50, 60, 70 people to do. And so, yeah, we're onto something here, right? This notion of focusing on competency and cross training and allowing people to give everything they have to a role was huge. So we were punching way above our weight in the missions that we were assigned, which was great, made us really, really valuable as a deployable unit. And so I got out of the military, and I've brought that, it's now my civilian career as a consultant and now as a policy wonk as well. And that's because the whole notion of developing people, of growing people, is the cornerstone of any successful business. It's the one thing we don't spend a whole lot of time on, but it's what makes organizations successful, and so that part of that background and then trying to bring that forward into the work that I do. It keeps things interesting because it's a constantly changing and shifting environment. So that's I guess that's my mission, and it has been since the 1980s.
Well, it really shows how you brought the competency that you developed in the military onto the next role that you're taking on. So that's a great
Mm.
example of what you were talking about earlier. One of the reasons I reached out to you, Jeff, was because of an
Yeah.
article you wrote. The name of
Hmm.
the article, Can Canada Build Its Way to Prosperity? We Need Many More Skilled Workers First. I found
Hmm.
myself highlighting many quotes I want to ask you about real quickly, but for the purpose of this podcast and program,
Mm.
I'm going to get us started with the following quote. And this is important to me because I'm big on changing things within the education system. So this is the quote. Canada's sclerotic apprenticeship systems follow an archaic model that has remained largely unchanged since the 1950s.
Hmm. Um,
What? Okay, if you don't need a question, go ahead. Go.
no,
I
I
think
guess
you
you
know
want to
what
know
I'm
what am
thinking.
I what am I what the hell is he talking about? It's interesting. I've been involved in the apprenticeship world for just about 25 years now since I became since I left the military. And there was a number of years ago, I gave a talk at a national conference, the Canadian Society for Training and Development, now known as I4PL. And this was a project that we just completed, and we were looking at a particular apprenticeship program within the construction industry. And so we had designed a different way of doing uh, construction and doing the apprenticeship. And so we were presenting the results on that. But I told the story about a gentleman that I had had a chat with, who had been a foreman in a steel fabrication shop. And he got called down to the office because folks from the Ministry of Labor wanted to talk to him. And he was like, oh, shit, what have I done now? Um, as it turned out, these folks were from the apprenticeship branch, and this is in Ontario. Um, and they wanted to talk to him because he'd been trained in his trade in Europe. He's a Brit, and they were asking him questions about what did he learn, how was it done, all this kind of technical details around how apprenticeship was being done. And so he told them, and so they were scribbling notes the way people do. Um, and at the end they said, "Oh, well, this is really good stuff. We should do something like that, right?" And the punchline of the story is the person I was talking to was referring to a story with my father, who was a sheet metal mechanic and worked as he was a foreman in a steel fab shop. The conversation we were discussing happened in 1954 at the shop where he was working at. And so here we were 50 plus years later, and nothing had changed. It was still doing it the same way. So there have been lots of reforms, and they've kind of nibbled their way around the edges. And here in Alberta, they've made some significant, try to make some improvements to apprenticeship. But effectively, the system has not changed. And there are lots of examples in other jurisdictions around the world where they're doing a far better job of it in terms of generating skills quicker because they're using competency basis, generating the skills that industry really needs by modularizing apprenticeships and things like that. And that's a problem. And in the article from the hub, we can't generate the number of skills that industry requires, particularly in the construction sector. If anybody reads the article, I mean, it's a massive workforce issue. And the systems that we're using to generate those skills are not working. They can't do it quick enough, and they can't handle the volumes. So they're also not really aimed at the small employer, which in the construction sector, particularly if you're looking at residential construction, is most employers, right? It's aimed at much larger corporations, much larger entities who can handle all the paperwork, who can handle all of the other stuff. So, and then if you look at the incentives that are being offered, so it's a multifaceted problem. But if you look at the incentives that are offered to employers and to individuals, It's for the full-on 4-year Red Seal apprentices, which, other than certain compulsory trades in the construction sector, may not actually be what's required, and particularly in the residential construction sector. So we need to modify what we're doing in order to make it work for the smaller specialized firms and get them involved in generating the skills that they need themselves, provide them with the incentives, provide them with the flexibility in how they go about doing it. So if we can't do that, then we're stuck in the same boat that we're in now, and we'll be having this conversation in 50 years about what we should really make some changes. So the system as it is right now, regardless of which province you're in, it's atrophied. It's focused on bringing people into apprenticeship rather than getting them out of apprenticeship. It doesn't recognize people who have left a 4-year apprenticeship because they can work in in certain sectors with the skills that they've learned without finishing an apprenticeship, and there's no way of documenting that. And it's really not in tune with what the economy needs, what the employers need. We could get into a whole different aspect around understanding and recognizing skills of people who are trained in other countries, right? Passing a Red Seal exam doesn't mean you're actually competent. It means you can pass the Red Seal exam. And we need ways to get people whose first language isn't English or French to demonstrate their skill and be certified in trades that way. And we don't have any good systems to do that. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does, it does. But in our previous conversation, Jeff, you asked one question about how do you know if a person is competent upon, finishing a competency course.
It really gets into, like, I'll go back to my military background, because I was an instructor in the Air Force, and we were trained using a method which is all about what is the performance standard. So we started with, at the end of this module of training, the individual will be able to do what? Given what circumstances, what conditions, what tools, whatever, perform what task to what standard. And that was our endpoint assessment. And then we built the whole program to get there, right? And we don't have that established in apprenticeships. Some years ago, it was about probably 2001, I think, in British Columbia, and they blew up the old system under ITAC, and by stroke of a pen, they decided we have a competency-based system. And I remember being at the meeting, which was at the BC Business Council back then, and talking to the deputy minister. He drew short straw, I guess, and got to present this to all the union guys that were at that meeting around what they were going to do. And as I was, helping him bandage up his wounds afterwards, we said, like, this is a great idea. Have you defined competent? I said, what do you mean? I said, well, for every task in that occupational analysis, you have to define what the safety standard is, what the quality standard is, and what the productivity standard is for competent performance. And if you haven't done that yet, then we have no objective way of telling if someone's competent. So you don't have a competency-based system. And they said, oh. And they still don't. They haven't changed it. Right. And so it's understanding what that is, really defining what that exit criteria from a training program or from a certification program or anything else looks like. That's where you start. And if you've built that and you've built it properly, now creating certification testing, on the job testing, becomes a whole lot easier because you have an objective standard to measure against. You can design pre-employment testing for the same thing, right? And we hear a lot about testing, oh, competency-based employment testing, oh, it's so expensive, it's so this, it's so that. But every chef, like if you show up at the back of a restaurant and say, oh, I'm a cook, I'm a line cook, they'll know in 10 minutes if you're actually competent. They'll have you chop a bunch of onions or, make an omelet or something that will demonstrate the skills. And they'll ask you some questions while you're doing it. My dad back in the days of this with the steel shop, same thing. Hand someone a set of blueprints. Can you said you're a fitter. What would you build that out of? Can he read a print, right? Can take them back to the racks. Can they select the right materials? Read a specification, read a bill of materials. Can they do a spark test on a piece of random steel to find out what kind of steel it is? Because if they're an actual fitter, they'll know how to do that. Those tests cost nothing and don't take any time at all, and competent people can design them, right? And it gives you a really good gauge, right, on whether someone's actually knows what they're doing, far more than passing the test.
I love the work you're doing, and I appreciate the detailed examples you provided. I will have a lot more questions later on about the
Sure.
article, but I want to move on to talk about more about your experience where you've led a few projects leading change in employment competency frameworks. A couple examples of your work: you led a major overhaul to the competency framework for the certified management consultant profession in Canada. You were also involved in creating an entire competency framework for the Canadian bioeconomy. Your
Yep.
work is very interesting and caught my attention. From what you're saying, I'm assuming that you think the apprenticeship system needs an overhaul,
Yeah.
but I'll let you detail a little bit or more on that.
I think that given like I'll go back again, back to square one. Years and years and years ago, we were doing a project. It's my first exposure to the Red Seal occupations in detail. So we were mapping what people needed to be able to do in a bunch of manufacturing plants. And trying to be logical, we'll start with what it says in the Red Seal standards. And so we use that as the baseline. And what we found was that many of the things which used to be in discrete occupations aren't anymore. So there's a lot of bleed over around the edges between what used to be very discrete trades. And a lot of the things that were most important to the employer weren't actually part of the occupational standard. So we did a job in BC in sawmills, and we were finding that a large chunk of what the electricians in those plants, maintenance electricians, were doing wasn't part of the electrical apprenticeship, but it was critical to the success of the business. And there were no modules that addressed that. So people who were successful were picking this up over time on their own, either through self-study, through on-the-job learning, trial and error, vendor training, whatever. And yet, these were the things that were most critical to the employer. So I think we need to modularize it. I think we need to understand that there are some core pieces of many trades that's the same across all of them. And so modularize it and give employers the ability to literally custom design an apprenticeship based around the skills that they actually need within their plant. Now, that doesn't prevent someone from eventually filling out all of the other squares and becoming more skilled, more well-rounded. But it would encourage more employers to actually train instead of stealing from everybody else. If we look at, again, I mentioned about the metal trades, the National Institute for Metallurgical Standards in the U.S., NIMS, they've developed a modular apprenticeship like that employers can use to custom build the skill set that they require in metal fabrication and machining trades in the U.S., which gives small employer, an ability then, okay, I can get involved in apprenticeship. Whereas if, as it stands now, unless you're doing all of it, you can do none of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a problem, right? So that for me, that's the first thing I would look at is how we can create much more flexibility. As another example, we saw this in manufacturing sector in Ontario, where the employers, what they needed was someone who really, and we're seeing it actually in Alberta with the wind power industry, the folks that maintain wind turbines. Well, what do you need? Well, you need someone who's a combination of a millwright, an instrument mechanic, and an industrial electrician, and a few other things besides. But there's no way to train that. So the people get trained either within the industry, because you can't start three apprenticeships simultaneously and do the bits that are important to the employer. And no employer is going to put someone through three different apprenticeships at 4 years each, right? It's not particularly cost effective. And so that discourages employers from getting involved in a process which is really, really, really useful for the industry. It's really good for the economy. It allows people to learn a useful set of skills without having to spend the money to go to school necessarily. And it's a time-honored way of training that we're handcuffing industry from taking full advantage of, and I think that's really unfortunate.
That's very unfortunate. You really highlighted a few examples that things can't change. It's doable.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for you. Would
Sure.
you be willing to lead such an overhaul if given the opportunity? And what would you start with?
Um, it's funny you asked that because we're actually in the process of trying to do that. One of one of the things we're working on right now at Canada West Foundation is we're starting to pull together a coalition of employers groups in the construction sector specifically to look at what we can do differently and how we can design ways that address the employer's needs across the different construction sectors, because commercial construction isn't quite the same as residential construction, which isn't quite the same as road building or heavy civil work, but they have components that are transferable. And the current system again doesn't really address a lot of what they're doing. So I was talking to someone from the Canadian Home Builders Association a month or so ago, and they were saying that the home building sector, low-rise residential and renovations, gets a lot of flack because they don't support apprenticeship. And the problem is its apprenticeship doesn't support them. Right. And so we're looking at leading that, bringing that group together and trying to figure out what we can do. And then it needs to be industry led. It has to be responsive to the employer. And I think there's ways we can do it that are cost effective, rapid, and will give the industry the boost that it needs. We've got however many millions of new homes they want to construct in this country, and we've got no workforce to do it. We've got 11 plus million homes that'll need retrofitting to meet energy standards that are being introduced by Enercan. We've got all kinds of infrastructure. Ask anybody in Calgary about waterworks, right? Right. We've got aging municipal infrastructure across the
Exactly.
country, all of which needs to be replaced, maintained or added to. We've got roads and bridges that need to be rebuilt. We've got industrial projects that need construction. And the one thing about construction, I think, in terms of the overall economy and why we want to focus on it is because nothing in the country will happen if you didn't build it. And construction is one sector that we cannot offshore, right? So there's lots of things we can import from overseas. Buildings aren't one of them. And so we have to build things. We have to build infrastructure. We have to build the whole of our built environment, and we need people to do that. And so that's the sector that we're focusing on. And I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be able to come up with some interesting things that'll really be useful for the industry.
This is a very exciting project. I will have to catch up with you in a few months to see where you're at and how things are moving.
It's early days yet. We're starting those initial conversations, but so far the response from industry has been very positive. They want to try and solve this. So let's see if we can solve it in Alberta first and then move it across the country.
This is very good news for the high school students that I work with. They can really go take a program if interested
Yeah.
in apprenticeship, right?
Mhm.
And
Well, I mean,
construction.
yeah, well, the Calgary Construction Association is they've done a really impressive job in K to 12 on helping people understand just how cool construction is. So they've got materials. They work with the CBE and the Catholic Board to create this outside of any governmental thing. They just went and said, "Look, we've got this industry, and it's really cool. You should maybe have a look at it." So the Calgary Construction Association is doing some really, really innovative things in this space. And that's great for attraction. Now what we want to do is work with those industry groups and look at, okay, so how do we do the training better, right? Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, we
That's
did
the
a
important step because you
yeah.
get there and then, yeah, yeah,
Well, and
the
I
more
mean,
structure.
we did it again. I'll go back in history, but we did a project a bunch of years ago now, design an entire apprenticeship program for masons and bricklayers, and then tested it over about a 3 month period with different contractors in different provinces. And we also had a control group that was doing things the traditional way, and then looked at how fast people learned, what they learned, what their competencies were at the end of this trial period, and and then also how the journey persons that were doing the training, leading the training and mentoring the candidates, the new apprentices, how they were feeling about this, and also how the apprentices were feeling about it, right? So and the results were across the board phenomenal. Like we were seeing skills acquisition twice as fast as it was in the traditional systems. Um, and then we finished the project, we handed it back to the project sponsor, and nothing happens.
It's that follow-up that you and I were talking
Right.
about.
I mean, and that's the thing is it needs to be a continuous process, and it needs to have some traction, and it needs to be industry led. And that's if industry is leading it, industry will make sure that it has traction and follow up because it's in their best interest to do that.
If you
So
have any links to the result on that project, please share it with me. I'll put it in the link. Maybe someone will read read about it and get excited about it and see if they
um,
can follow up on it.
sure, if anybody's interested in looking at it, I have an entire hard copy of this thing. This is back in the days before everything was electronic.
Okay.
I'd be glad to share it with anybody who's interested in having a look. I'm sure we could even do it better now because we could have tracking systems and some electronic systems that would make tracking and managing through that process significantly easier for the contractors. We were working in this case with a couple of the construction unions, so tracking it through the union halls. Again, it was all done with paper and pencil back then, but I'm sure we could do a far better job of it now.
There you go. A new project for you to consider. But I was going to ask you a question about the new challenges that you are planning on taking on soon that allow you to step out of your comfort zone into what we now call the stretch zone.
Yeah.
Just for the young people who may be watching and thinking, well, how do I challenge myself?
The reason I'm still doing this is because I'm always looking, like how do we do this better? How do we do things differently? That's a mindset more than anything else. So, I mean, mindset is critical. Believing that growth is possible, that your skill set isn't fixed is the first step. If you've convinced yourself that your skill set isn't fixed and that you can grow and learn and that that's a continuous process, that that encourages you to keep going. One of the things I've been playing with lately, there's a movement quite popular actually in Germany, which is weird because the guy who invented it was an American, but working out loud is what it's called. So fellow named John Stepper out of the U.S. is the author of this, and there's a book and there's a website and a bunch of this other stuff. So I became familiar with some of John Stepper's work a few years ago, and I've always been thinking, how do I do that? But the idea is that if you learn and think out there in the public where people can throw darts at you, that's actually good because it encourages you to be open to feedback and criticism. And through that, take on even other new ideas and improve the quality of the work you do and the learning. So I thought that's kind of cool. It's actually terrifying, but it's kind of cool. So I'm launching a new website, a personal website, which should be live in the next week or so, www.jeffgriffiths.ca if anybody's interested. And that's going to be my kind of working out loud laboratory, which is way outside my comfort zone. And the whole idea is where I'm going to kind of noodle on ideas and things I'm reading and things I'm thinking about and all of, how we do a better job in this world in terms of competency and competency-based approaches to hiring and to training and to certification. Some of what I do on that site may wind up becoming useful for the work that I do at a micro level at Workforce Strategies. Some of it might wind up being useful at the macro level and influence some of the things that I'm doing at Canada West. Some of it won't go anywhere because it's just junk, but that's okay. So I'm stepping outside, I'm throwing that out in the world, and I want to encourage not to be afraid to be told I'm wrong, right? So yeah, like I said, that's terrifying, but it's also really, really exciting. And I'm confident that by doing this, if we were to have this conversation in 6 months' time or a year's time, I am going to know so much more about these things that I'm trying to work with. But I'll have also created a network of other people around the world who are also working in the same space. And those kinds of connections and learning from each other that can grow out of it are, I think, that's as important as what I'm going to learn on my own. And I hope that outweighs all the scars and bruises that I'm going to have when I'm finished. So yeah, there's something
Um,
I'm doing that's way outside of my comfort zone and new.
I'm looking forward to seeing the website and see what noodles you're going to put out there. Definitely. And I will
Yeah.
put the link in the
Mhm.
chat as well in the comments section.
Okay.
These were all the questions I had prepared for you, Jeff. Would you like to help me wrap up the episode by adding something that you wanted to share, but I didn't ask you about, or any tips that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, for like your audience, you have a lot of work with high school students and with folks who are at the beginning of their careers. And and I guess the only thing I have to say is like, don't be afraid, right? I mean, you're going to have multiple careers in your life. The things you learn when you first start your career may not even exist 5 years after you start your career because the world is changing so quick. But that's okay, right? Try things, experiment with things, learn things. Don't be afraid of having the wrong answer. That's another thing we need to fix in education. Uh, we
Another
could have a
conversation.
whole other episode just talking about that. But the reality is, in the real world, there aren't all that many mistakes that you can't recover from. And so if you're open and you're vulnerable and you're willing to try things and you're willing to experiment and be curious and just see where that leads, I think most people will be really surprised about where it goes and where they wind up. And so I'd encourage, if that's one thing, right? Go be curious and stay curious.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for this wonderful tip and for your time today and joining me on How to Get Your Info.
All right. Thanks.
That's it for Hoda's Career Info, the program where career professionals from across the globe join me to empower you to succeed. Our guest today on Hoda's Career Info was Jeff Griffiths. You can connect with Jeff on LinkedIn. Jeff advised us to be curious and stay curious. How curious are you? Really? Reflect and describe yourself by responding to the question, how are you a curious person? Remember that you can watch Hoda's Career Info on YouTube or listen to the episode on your favorite podcast app. To let me know if you are interested in an opportunity to talk about your work, you can send me a direct message on my website, rightcareerfit.com, where you can also sign up for my newsletter to stay up to date on the latest episodes. Please like, subscribe, share, and follow me on social media for more career info. I am your host, Hoda. Until next time, remember that your time is very precious. How are you spending it?